All right. Hi, everybody. My name is John. I am a principal designer for a company called Newell Brands, who are behind Prismacolor and Sharpie and Papermate. I'm also a freelance illustrator and fine artist, um, and I go by the name of Flux. And what I'm here to do today is to kind of give you an intro to watercolor using watercolor pencils, specifically Prismacolor Premier watercolor pencils. Excuse me. So if you like, we would love it if you would hashtag make it with Michaels. If you promote any of your work on social media, and also throw in some at Prismacolor. Um, and if you want to, you can check out more of my work at Flux Artist. And that's on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. And I guess I will go ahead and get started. If you want to switch the camera, I'm going to go through just basically what I'll be working with. It's essentially this collection of Premier watercolor pencils. There's 12 in the box, or the 10 rather. And I'm going to go through each one as we're working. I have a Prismacolor Magic Rubber Eraser. Any kind of just gum eraser like this will do. And then also I have a watercolor pad. If you have any kind of paper with tooth, that's great. Any other paper will work too. If you're using like a regular thin printer paper, if that's all you have handy, I would recommend putting something underneath in case the paint goes through. I have a 2H pencil. So for those of you that don't know, pencils come in a variety of hardness and softness. The typical pencil is 2B, and B means soft, so it'll be pretty dark. H pencils tend to be, they're a harder lead, they're a little lighter, they're nicer to work with for putting like down sketches beforehand because they don't really show through that well. But if you only have a 2B, that's fine, just try to work pretty lightly. And then I have the reference, and this is basically a picture of a flower, a lotus, but it's used, I used actually a Photoshop texture over the top to give it a watercolor effect because it's really just being used as a reference. And this is an extra sheet of paper. I would recommend having some paper on the side just to mess around with when you're working with these before you actually put your stuff down, because it's definitely a learning experience and something to get used to. So the other thing that you'll need is some brushes. I believe we referenced a pack for the class. I'm going to be using basically this one. This is the number 5 size round brush. You can use other brushes, and I'll show a little bit of how to use those as we go along. And then water, a little cup of water, some kind of, cup that you don't care about that much. And then paper towels. These are going to be coming in handy for lots of reasons. So the one thing I would do before we start is, if you have your paper towels handy or some kind of rag or something like that, make a little area for blotting. So I'm going to keep that on the side. And then before I even start drawing, I want to go through a few ways that you can use watercolor pencils. So one would be the obvious. I'm going to grab this Copenhagen blue. It's a nice dark blue. And I'll go ahead and start off with quite a bit of pressure. And I'm going to hold this up to the phone in a minute so you can see what I'm doing a little closer. And get lighter as I go. So see that up close. And then I'm going to take this round brush, dip it in the water, and just tap it once on the paper towel to get that excess drop off, and go ahead and start to mess around with this. And just, you'll see that I'll go back and grab a little bit more water, that this has a feel like traditional watercolor. And wherever I put the darker, like the more pressure, you'll see that the paint is a little bit darker right there. So that's one way you can use these. Another way is to actually go ahead and just put some water down. So one thing to keep in mind is if you're using water and a brush in a jar, I really recommend never leaving your brush in that jar of water, because what'll happen is the hair, the bristles on the brush will bend and they'll stay that way permanently. If you want to keep your brushes for a long time, I recommend just, drying them out flat so that doesn't happen. All right, so here is another way that you can use watercolor brushes. So I'm just going to put some water down, and you can do it this way. I'm not blotting because I just want to get a lot of water in there. And if you take your pencil, you can actually start to draw in that water. So it gives you a little bit of a different effect. It's kind of, the color's a little bit more intense right away, but then you can go back and do this again and play around with it that way. So that's the second way, the second method. And the third is actually you can take your pencil and hold it up, put a little water on your brush, and almost use your pencil like a watercolor, like you would get in a tray, and use it like you would just normally paint watercolor. So you don't have to start with putting any color down on the paper. It kind of defeats the purpose of using a watercolor pencil, but just so you know, you have that option. And if you can get, a very nice watercolor effect doing it that way. Okay. So moving on, I'm going to start with just a sketch here. And using this as my guide, I'm going to kind of go through like a quick way to do this. So obviously there's many ways to recreate photo reference. One way is you can make a grid. If you put a grid of lines of squares, evenly spaced squares on the top here, and redraw that grid here, you can do it bigger or smaller. You can work that way, but I'm not going to work that way. I'm just going to kind of work loosely. So I'll start with this top petal here and not really thinking about detail. I want to get the contour. This is called the contour drawing of the shape. So I'm going to put in this next petal and work in the one next to it. And I'll hold this up so you can see what I'm doing. So you can see that I just have these very simple shapes in here. And then as you're drawing, think about where each shape is where it is in relation to the other shapes. And I'll explain what that means in a second. So now that I've got a sense of these three, I can figure out sort of the rest of the art. I've got this petal over here and another petal coming behind and another petal underneath. And I'm sort of thinking about the overall shape and whether it's pretty close. And I wouldn't worry about being so perfect. I mean, obviously what you're doing is expressive anyway, so you don't have to be too concerned about it being exact. But I'm just getting in like the major shapes here.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
I think people are trying to see what you're drawing a little bit better. Will you
Yes.
hold it up or maybe even press down a little bit harder?
So there, can you guys see?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. I don't want to press down too hard, but I can definitely give it a little bit more.
Yeah, I think holding it up works.
Okay. But even just for the video, maybe I will press down a little harder so you guys can see the marks. All right. And then just kind of looking at the petals next to each other. Okay, so I've got this petal here that I just drew. There's a petal next to it. It ends right here. And where is that in relation to this piece? So I'm kind of thinking about all these shapes and how they are in relationship to each other. And it's almost like as if you're creating a placeholder for everything. You don't want to get down detail, just very simple shapes. And again, just kind of looking at where things are, going back and forth with your eye. If something looks like, oh, that's too high over here, just go ahead and erase that piece and redraw. This is all going to get painted over. It's okay if you erase and redraw as much as you need to. So, and if you guys, if you're getting stuck sort of on this spot, you will always be able to look at this video later. It'll be available on the Michael's website, and kind of, pause and rewind or fast forward or whatever as you need to. All right, so basically got the gist here. Just a few more pieces to go. And you'll notice my drawing is even a little bit wider than the original photograph, which is fine. It does not have to be, like I said, perfect, even proportionately. Now, if you were drawing a person, that might be a different story. I would suggest using a grid or something like that. But if you're doing something like a flower, or any kind of scenery, you can definitely take a little creative liberty with that sort of thing. All right. So I've got my
John, will you hold it up again?
basic flower here.
Perfect. Thank you.
And then I'll put this next to it so you can see just sort of how that translates. All right. So before I actually start with this part, I'm going to pull out this test paper because I do, like I said, think it's a good idea to try these out on the side before you get started. So while I'm going through a few of these explanations, if you guys want to try out on a separate piece of paper, just kind of what I did here, those 3 techniques, see one that works best for you. I'm probably going to stick with mostly the first one. We're drawing first and then going back in with water. But I recommend sharpening all of these to a decent point. The reason being is because you get a lot more control and you can get a lot more gradients and gradation in your tones. They normally come very short, and that doesn't give you a lot of flexibility. So I guess so I'm going to move on to the piece and start with
John, really quick.
Sure.
Oh, perfect. You're already moving the reference photo back. That's what I was going to ask.
Okay, right. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. So I am going to start by building this background. And the background has a little bit of purple, a little bit of black. We don't necessarily have a purple here in the collection. We've got blue and red, which make a nice purple. So I'm going to go ahead and take my Copenhagen and start to draw around the sketch. And still looking at the photograph, because maybe I can perfect some things if I want to. But I'm really leaving that flower empty.
John, there was a question about whether you have a favorite sharpener for your pencils.
I have an Exacto electric sharpener. It's the horizontal one. I'm not sure what the model is, but it's really nice. It definitely sharpens watercolor pencils and regular pencils very well. And the nice thing is it has a stop feature, so it'll stop sharpening when it's done, so you don't end up over sharpening anything. But you could also use its traditional little mini sharpeners, those metal ones. Those work just fine. They're just a little messier, obviously, because you have to clean up the shavings. Speaking of messy, though, on here, you'll see that a lot of times when you use these pencils, or any colored pencils in general, you have some debris left over. So you can blow on it to get rid of it. You can shake your paper to get rid of it. I wouldn't recommend using your hand. The reason being is it'll leave streaks across your artwork. So just something to keep in mind as you're doing this. All right.
Hey, John, a couple people are asking if they can see the sharpener that you use. Do you have it right there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
Pull it into the frame. So this is it. Oh, freeze. So it's an Exacto. Like I said, I don't know the model, but it's a horizontal sharpener. It's really nice. I'll actually use it right now. Works really well. It gives you a nice point. Which, you know, like I said, is really good for doing this sort of work. Obviously, as you're doing stuff like this, where you're putting a lot of pressure down and covering a lot of space, it's going to want, you know, wear down on your tip, and that's fine. But for all intents and purposes, for this background, we're really not working on detail, so it's really okay to let it sort of get worn down there. And I'm not really going to mimic this background exactly. So I just really want to kind of use it as a guide, and you'll see as I'm going along how that works out.
John, can you shift your pad over so that the full reference photo is in frame?
Yes.
And people are just catching up. Perfect. Thank you.
Sure. All right, just about done here. Kind of getting around the entirety. Okay, so a little bit more on the right-hand side. I'm not really concerned about the direction of these strokes because it's just going to get painted anyway. But, you know, at this point, there are some different things you can do. If you want, you can make it darker around the edges of your artwork, which is kind of nice. So I'll go back in, sharpening again. And darken around the art itself. And this might not, you know, make much of a difference at this point, but it will when you actually add the water.
Hey, John, I just got a question about the pros and cons of doing the background first versus waiting to do it last.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, honestly, I think doing the background first is nice because it sort of locks you in to your drawing. But if you're feeling like you might want to be more experimental and you might want to be able to change your drawing after the fact, then definitely by all means go the other way around. I think it's also nice because it sets the tone for the whatever you're drawing on top of it. So you basically are, you know, going to be stuck with this background, and it kind of allows you to then pick a color to go on top that goes with it, depending on what you're doing. It also helps with just like the lighting and that sort of thing. If you're creating the lighting of the background, you know, the whatever's in the foreground should match it in some way. That's really the advantage of it. All right, so I'm going to add a little bit of crimson red here to get a little more purple. So you'll see, like in the picture, there's some purple tones. I also want to show how this works when we add the water to it for blending. So I'm just going to do like the lower area with some red here. All right. And now I'm going to add some water. So you take your brush, you know, dip it in the water, blot it a couple times on the paper towel. And I recommend doing that too a lot in the beginning until you get really comfortable with it, because it can be a little unwieldy. But, you know, if you start mixing this in, you'll see that it is nice and dark right around those edges. So, and you can take the paint too and drag it around. So if there's an area like, say, here I've got this where this petal detail comes in here. I didn't have that with when I put down the watercolor pencil. I can now do that just with the water. as I
Hey,
paint.
John, can you just point out again real quick where you had added the red?
Sure, just all around this bottom area, because
Perfect,
it'll give
thanks.
it a little bit more of a purple tone. No problem. And then, you know, if you kind of go in bold strokes, you'll really see this nice watercolor effect. And, um, you know, the more you go, obviously, if you play around with this and you feel more confident, then you can go with, you know, a lot more water. Um, and that water really, you know, like I said, pushes that watercolor effect even more. It can get a little tricky when you're going to do detail like this. So I'm gonna blot a little bit there. Right, get into that petal detail. And the same over here. And I'm gonna hold this up so you guys can see how it looks up close.
Hey, John, I got a question about why you prefer water or Prismacolor watercolor pencils over different brands.
I think that the color is really rich and very strong with Prismacolor. That's basically the reason. I mean, they're also nice how they feel when you're painting with them. It feels like real watercolor paint. But the color is really, to me, the most important thing. Having some kind of vibrant tone, I think, is really nice. I like vibrant colors myself, where some other brands can look a little more muted. All right, so I'm going to hold this up so you guys can see, but if you notice, the bottom has more of a purplish tone than the top, which is more blue, because I added that red. Um, it might not look as vibrant on the screen, depending on your monitor, so that all depends on obviously what kind of connection you have. But just kind of going in and putting a little bit of detail around the edges of the flower. And then this might seem like an obvious thing, but be careful not to let your hand rest on the artwork, especially when the paint is wet, because it'll pick up the art and obviously get your hand made dirty.
John, will you talk about some of the reasons why you might use watercolor pencils instead of like a tray of watercolor, especially for something big like the background?
Um, because I like the effect, I think that it's nice to have this effect that, you know, if you'll see like in the detail, you can see some of the streaks from the colored pencil. I personally like that, but it's also, it's a personal preference, you know. Some people, I think a lot of people, you know, have only used colored pencil and they want to try watercolor. This is a nice way to sort of transition into doing that. Um, so I would recommend it for people, especially if they're kind of they've never done watercolor before, because I think watercolor can be a little bit intimidating. Um, it's a nice way to kind of get into that medium. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead, so bring this up a little bit. Finish with my background now, and again, not too concerned about being perfect. You know, this isn't really that kind of artwork. Because it is expressive. Okay. All right. So we got our background in there. And now we've also got just our shape to work with. So what I'm going to do next is just really kind of clean off the brush, run it in the water a little bit. And then when you blot it on the paper, you can see if you've got, you know, any paint left on your brush. And then I'm going to move on to start doing some of these petals. So obviously this pencil Copenhagen is a dark blue. The next blue, the other blue in the tin, is True Blue, which is lighter and it's very nice. I'm going to actually start with that for these petals. So what I would recommend is going in lightly. You guys can see, I'll get up closer as well. And I'm going to work sort of each petal individually. Now, if it's hard to see in the photograph, but there are actually 2 petals up here. I'm just going to work it as if it were 1. That's up to you, whether you want to do 2 or 1. But I think this will be a nice way to just sort of get started here and showing you some tips and tricks on how to make this look cool. So I'm basically filling it in here. Now that I've got that filled in, I'll hold it up close. You guys can see. And I didn't put too much pressure on it. And then taking my brush with a little bit of water, I'll go in and spread that around. And as you're spreading, you'll see that like at the edges, it can get darker. You're gonna have some pooling of water, and that's totally fine. But try to stay in that petal.
Hey, John, I got a question about what if you make a mistake and if there's any way to lift the color?
Well, so that's what I'm going to show actually right now. Sometimes you can lift the color if it's still wet enough. So what I'm going to recommend is next up, get a piece of your paper towel, like a small amount, right? Crumple it up a little bit. Maybe have a flat side to it, and you can press and pick up. And what's cool is that this not only has the texture of the watercolor paper, but it also has some texture from the paper towel. And it's a really nice way to sort of finish off your painting. If it's wet enough, you can actually scrub and get some of that paint up. So that is an option as well. So I'm looking at this versus that. I know I need to make it a little darker and maybe a little more purple at the top. And, you know, this works great, not only to get this cool effect, but sometimes you don't want to wait until that water eventually dries up because you can't go back over with other colors really until it dries. If you were to try to mix in another color while it's wet, it gets really unpredictable and you're not, you know, it's hard to say like what it's going to look like when you're done. So now I can go in with my darker color. I'm going to sharpen it, the Copenhagen, and add to the top so that it gets a little darker up there. And as I'm going down, I'm releasing the pressure because the color gets lighter as I go down. So now if I go back in with my water, you'll see, and I'm blotting as I go because I don't want to have too much water in there. I got this really, I think it's a beautiful watercolor effect where it gets darker toward the top. And I'll pull it up on closer to the camera as well. All right. Hope you guys can see how that changes over. And then I'm going to repeat the process just as I go around. So like, here's my next petal over here. And if you feel more comfortable sort of going in all around and doing what I'm doing, as opposed to individual petals, please go ahead and do that. I feel like this is nice because you have more control in the event that you did paint over an area that you weren't supposed to, or it's a little harder to go back. But if you do petals individually, it kind of makes it a little more forgiving. All right, so I've got this petal here. I'm going to get some more paper towel. I wouldn't use the same one you just used because it will actually pick up that paint off of that. let that dry. You can blow on it to dry it as well. And then go back in with my darker Copenhagen for the darker tones at the top. And you might like leaving it this way, like just leaving in this colored pencil shading. That's fine too. I'm really kind of going for an overall watercolor look here, but again, this is really your call as far as how you want it to look in the end. So I'll go back in, get some water here, spread that around. And it's a little darker than the reference, but that's okay too. We don't have to be perfect. I'm kind of going back into this one and spreading things around a little bit there too. All right, so moving on, next petal. This one I'm probably gonna add a little bit more other color into it. But as I'm going along here, I have a few sort of trivia questions, and I guess we can post the answers in the chat. The first one is, does anyone know when Prismacolor watercolor, or not watercolor, Prismacolor color pencils first launched? I used them in college. People older than me and that I know use them in college also. They've been around for a long time. So I'm wondering if anyone can guess that correct year.
1935, 1945, 82, 72, 38, 70.
Oh, we got a 38. We got a winner. Awesome. I'm sorry, but there's no prize. There's just the joy of knowing you know what you're talking about. I don't know if any of you watched the Great British Baking Show, and I don't know if I can say that on here, but I love that show, and I found out that all they get is a cake stand at the end, and I was very disappointed. All right, so I've got this, my lighter blue, and I'm gonna go in with some paper towel, blot that out. And you know, this could be a cool way to experiment if you guys want to like try different stuff that you know can stamp on there, maybe different textures than paper towel. Might look cool as well. And then I'm gonna go in, you'll see there's a shadow kind of behind that petal that goes onto the next one. And there's where I'm gonna put in this darker blue. But I'm also gonna add a little bit of red because there's some purple tones in there. So this time I'm going to try this other red. It is Carmine Red. Because the original one that I used, the Crimson Red was a little dark, and I think that was fine for the background, but I'm not sure if it's going to be so good for these. All right, so I've got that down. I'm going to blot my brush quite a bit here because I want to keep it pretty detailed to the shadow. So
I've got a question about using masking fluid.
Yeah.
Can you use that to mask certain areas?
Absolutely. Masking fluid's great, especially, you know, if you want to keep certain areas just plain white, it works really well. And just so you guys know, you know, you might be wondering like, why can't I just take a regular colored pencil and do this? The main reason is that these use a different binder. I'm actually going to go in with this blue because if you notice, sorry, I'm switching topics here, but there is a dark line right at the edge of the petal, and I'm going to use the blue as a pencil to take care of that. And I'll hold this up close so you can see. But the difference in the binder is that for colored pencils, most of them are wax, and I believe Prismacolor color pencils are wax, or they could be oil. But with these are a water soluble binder. So it's something to be cautious of. You don't want to get water on them. It'll uh, decay that a little bit, or too much water. Obviously, if you have an accident, can't do anything about that. But that is the basic difference between the two. All right, so I'm going to go in and do another petal here.
John, since watercolor paints dry lighter, do the watercolor pencils do the same? We had a couple of questions on that.
It depends. So not necessarily. If you're going in heavy, like I did with this background, then I think it pretty much dries how you see it. But if you go in lightly, yes, that's the case. It's like you'll see as I'm going along, I went ahead and just did both of these petals to kind of get that color down. And when I add water to it, compared to the one that I already let dry, it pretty much keeps the same lightness. So in that regard, it's not really the case.
I also got a question about once the paintings dry, are they always vulnerable to water or moisture, or do they dry fully stable?
I think that if you got it wet, it would probably mess with it a little bit. What I'd recommend is going in with like a fixative or a varnish, something just sort of seal it in. I think that would be a really good idea, especially if you want to keep it in good shape. All right. So I've got my shading here. I'm using my reference. For those of you who have never worked with a reference before, something that really comes in handy and will help to not get too bogged down in detail is to squint as you're looking. If you squint and look at your artwork and the photo and kind of look at both and say, oh, okay, you can really isolate shapes that way as opposed to getting bogged down in the details. And also it helps you see color a lot better. I had a teacher in college who wouldn't squint. He would cross his eyes, and I thought that was a little dangerous. So I didn't really follow in those footsteps. More so because I was afraid of just being cross-eyed permanently. All right, so I've got my darker tones in there, and I'm actually going to add a little bit of red to that as well. And I'm doing a couple of little light strokes there, going back in with the water to spread that around. And maybe even go back in with dark blue, again, just to give it a little bit more shading. Okay. All right, so I'm going to move to the center at this point because there's other colors involved there. There's blues, there's yellows, there's browns, there's even a little green. So I think this would be a good way to sort of talk about blending a little bit. So I did some blending in that background with the red and the blue. I've done some blending with the shading here. But I'm going to do some with this yellow and the brown as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and do with this a light pressure of true blue. Start working this area. Where I see that it's white, I'm not going to hardly put any there. So I'm working the area in the center. And I'll hold this up so you guys can see in just a minute. But I'm not, doing any detail. I'm just covering it with almost like a base coat, but leaving that area where there's white empty.
John, we got a question about framing watercolor work. Do you need to, or would you recommend framing it behind glass or open, similar to recommend framing it behind glass or open, similar to a canvas?
That's a really good question. I think that a lot of times watercolor looks really nice if it's just cut out, if it has torn edges and is attached to a background without glass on it. But obviously you would have to protect it with some kind of spray, but it looks just as nice behind glass as well.
And off the top of your head, is there a brand of fixative or of masking fluid that you like to use?
Not really a brand of a masking fluid, but Krylon makes a really good fixative. Um, the cool thing is that some of them, the fixatives, you can actually go back in and rework. It protects it, but also allows it to be reworkable. I know it doesn't make any sense, but I think it's just called workable fixative. All right, so I've got some blue down here for the center area. I'll hold that up so you guys can see. It's very light. And then I'm going to go in with some water. And what I'm trying to do is keep it pretty light where these white areas are. And while it's wet, I'm going to use my paper towel and blot some of that too, even as I'm going. And here's the cool thing about watercolor is you don't have to be so literal all the time. If you'd notice, a lot of people, the way they paint with watercolor, it almost looks abstract. So like these textures and shapes, they don't necessarily make up the details of the artwork. In other words, I'm not worried about these shapes that happen when I blot with a paper towel, whether or not they're forming exact petal edges. It's really just to get an effect across and then kind of working that effect around later. So I'll hold this up so you guys can see, but you know, it gives you some just really cool textures with that blotting technique. And I'll go back in with a little bit more water just to spread it around and blot it again using the other side of the paper towel. And the nice thing too is I still have that, you'll still have that pencil drawing underneath to kind of use as a guide for everything else. All right, so now I'm going to go in with this gold color. It's called Goldenrod. And looking at where these brown shadows are, start to work those in a little bit and sort of around there. And you'll see, like from the picture, where you'll see some yellow. You might need to squint to see that a little bit better. But, you know, kind of just putting it down lightly in the only areas where you really see the yellow. You can put it in where the brown is too, because it sort of mixes in with the brown. And the yellow here is really just kind of a glow on the photograph. So you don't have to get full coverage because remember, you're going to be spreading it around as you go in with some water. All right. Now that I've got that, I'll keep doing what I've been doing. Use some blotted water on the brush and mix that around. So I've got just a hint of yellow in there. All right. And then now I'll go in with my darker blue and start putting in some of the shadows. If I can find it. Here we go. Copenhagen. And work in a little bit more detail with that. I'm going to leave these brown areas for when we're done here to add the brown. But I'm just adding a little bit of dark blue here for the shadow in that petal. Some up here for more shading, even here It's okay if it goes over. Just gonna add some water to spread that around too. And you might want to even just keep that brush in your hand as you go. So part of this is really just kind of figuring out what works best for you too. Um, I'm showing some ways to do things, but you might, as you go along through this process, find things that make more sense to you.
Hey, John, when you get a minute, will you show the reference photo up close one more time?
Sure.
Thank you.
All right. There it is. And as you can see, I'm adding a little bit more shading and detail to these petals to match that a little bit better. Even going in, just on wet and mixing that way. So this also goes back to when I was talking about in the beginning, the different ways that you can do this. There are advantages to doing them all those ways. So I think an advantage to going back is, as you're going along, be like, okay, well, maybe I need to add a little bit more shadow to that. You don't necessarily have to wait for it to dry. You can draw and mix with a little bit of water on your brush. I wouldn't put too much on there. But I'll hold this up so you can see where I've added the darker blue.
John, have you used those water pen brushes that have the water actually in the brush? And would you recommend regular brushes over those or not
I
necessarily?
have never used those. Yeah. I have not used those, but I do like just using traditional brushes, basically because that's, what I was taught to use. I don't know how much kind of control you get with those, but I know people who like them a lot. So I think it's just a personal um, preference. All right, so I'm kind of blending a little bit of this together, adding a little more shading and painting as I go for the middle. Same down here. All right. And now that I think I've got a pretty good overall amount of painted detail here, we can get more down to the bottom in a minute. But I'm going to move on to the brown just because there's a lot of that makes up the shadows in this artwork. So just to break it down, I don't know if you guys are aware of midtones, shadows, and highlights, but this is sort of just a quick intro to that. In every image, and especially when you're painting or drawing, there are shadows, midtones, and highlights. So the shadows are going to be your darkest parts. The midtones are going to be, or actually, I'll just skip right to highlights. The highlights are going to be like the almost whites, sometimes white. And then the midtones are all those colors in between. So what I've been working mostly in here are midtones and highlights. That whole background is pretty much shadow, and there's a little bit of shadow here. But you'll notice in the center, what's missing are the shadows, and the shadows are these sort of brown tones in the middle. The shadows, as you get further out, are bluish, but I was sort of saving that area for the brown color. So we have a brown colored pencil, dark umber, it's part of the tin set here, and that's what I'm going to use to do this. But I think in this case, I'm actually going to do the third method, just to kind of go through that a little bit, since we've got about 10 minutes here, I think. And paint in that brown. So you might find that, drawing it in is easier, and that's great. But I just want to kind of give everybody an intro to all these ways that you can use the watercolor pencils. And especially if you're someone who's never used watercolor before, this would be a good transition. Going from, okay, I'm drawing with it, I feel comfortable, I'm able to make basic watercolor shapes. Now, maybe I can just go in ahead and paint with it. The nice thing about these two is that in some ways they're more opaque than watercolor when you go in thicker. So you can get a lot of nice dark, rich tones. And I think that also goes back to my comment about Prismacolor in particular. Their color pencils, their watercolor pencils, their markers, just the colors are really beautiful and very full. All right, so I got a little too much. I'm going to pick up some of that there. Maybe even add a little water to it, sort of taper that off. There we go. Hold it up close so you guys can see those brown shadows. And then finally, we won't be able to finish this whole thing today. I'm going to go in with some black. So you'll notice there's black in these shadows as well. And black is always the last color you want. I would never recommend going in with black right away because it's very strong. And if you mix black with other colors too much, it will take kind of the life out of the color. It makes it gray and muddy and doesn't seem to work that well. So I'm just adding a teeny bit of black here to the darkest part of the shadows. I'm spreading that around right there so you guys can see. All right, so I don't know if anybody has any other questions in the chat. Otherwise, I'd love to see some of the work people have done through this. And again, if you want, you can reach out to me on the social media platforms and even send me some of your work, and I'd love to take a look at it. And yeah, I'd love to see, let me see if I switch my view, hopefully, anybody want to hold up their work. Very nice. So I see Cindy Gordon's. That's beautiful. I love your background. I actually like your background better than my own. It's really nice. Oh, and Barbara He, beautiful. Yeah, I love the way that you spread out that background color. I think that's something that the more you experiment with, that abstract kind of painterly effect, you can get some really nice work out of that.
Hi, John. Would you share the hashtags again for everyone?
Yes, absolutely. Let me switch back to the regular. So hashtags are Make It With Michael, so that's the only hashtag. The other one is @Prismacolor, where you can tag using the @ symbol, and then also I'm at @FluxArtist. My website's fluxartist.com, so if you want to check out more of my stuff there, that's great. Let me take one last look. Anybody else sharing? And just to let everybody know that we have an upcoming class on May 14th, the hand lettering class with Sharpie paint. So definitely I would check that out. Wow, these are amazing.
And the class recording will also be up on michaels.com/classes. So if you guys want to come back and run back through it and pause, you can do that too.
Beautiful. It looks like, Cynthia Stanley, it looks like you have your own picture. Or if you did that out of your head, that's awesome. Gorgeous. Really nice work, everybody. Well, I hope you enjoyed the class, and good luck, and I hope to see you out there. So thanks a lot. Take care.